Let us begin with the words of Ben Sira. In my prayers, I asked outright for wisdom. And let's also acknowledge country in recognising the spiritual and cultural connections of the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples to country, and in continuing ACU's commitment to reconciliation. We acknowledge the First Peoples and traditional owners and custodians of the country where ACU campuses are located. We acknowledge elders, past and present, and thank them for their guidance as we walk in their footsteps. I'd just like to mention to my colleagues that on my screen I can see that there are 10 people who have entered the waiting room. I assume that they will be let in now. So I'd like to welcome everyone, and in particular friends from the participating partners of ACU's Plunkett Centre for Ethics: St Vincent's Public Hospital in Sydney, St Vincent's Private Hospital in Sydney, the Mater Hospital, Calvary Healthcare, the Mercy Hospital in Melbourne, and Cabrini Hospital in Melbourne. Let me tell you first how we mean to proceed. Our two presenters, Xavier Symons and Jim Franklin, will talk to us each for about 20 minutes with their sometimes common, sometimes contrasting approaches to this new document from the Dicastery for the Doctrine of the Faith. We'll give them an opportunity to respond to each other before we open up the discussion to everyone. It's at that point that our fellow Plunketteer, Dr. Steve Matthews from Melbourne, will take over. Steve will moderate the discussion, allowing all participants to ask questions or make comments. Until then, we'll all be muted, and Steve will unmute us for that discussion. And at the very end, I'll come back on deck to explain where to from here. Well, the well-known bioethicist Ruth Macklin claimed a little over 12 years ago that dignity is a useless concept in medical ethics, that it can be eliminated without any loss of content. Her views will be of particular interest to those of us who do work in healthcare. She made the claim in the British Medical Journal. She said, "A close inspection of leading examples shows that appeals to human dignity are either value restatements of other, more precise notions, or mere slogans that add nothing to an understanding of the topic." Well, I don't know what Macklin would think of the latest document from the Dicastery for the Doctrine of the Faith, but no one can truthfully claim that its appeals to human dignity, particularly in its final section where it talks of violations of human dignity, are based on vague restatements of other more precise notions or mere slogans. Indeed, 3/4 of the document goes to outlining and clarifying the classical conception of human dignity found not only in Jewish and Christian traditions, but also in early Greek and Roman thought. But let me leave all that to our two speakers, and let me introduce each of them now. Xavier Symons is Director of the Plunkett Centre for Ethics at Australian Catholic University. His research interests lie in ethical issues at the beginning and end of life, conscientious objection, the ethics of resource allocation, and the philosophy of well-being. Xavier was a postdoctoral research fellow at the Human Flourishing Program at Harvard University. He's also a Fulbright Scholar and holds degrees from the University of Sydney, the University of Oxford, and Australian Catholic University. James Franklin was Professor of Mathematics at the University of New South Wales. He's the author of several books, including Corrupting the Youth, A History of Philosophy in Australia, and Catholic Thought and Catholic Action. He is the editor of the Journal of the Australian Catholic Historical Society. His recent book, The Worth of Persons, A Foundation of Ethics, defends an ethical theory which is similar to that in Dignitas Infinita, and he'll talk about that today. So, over to you, Xavier.
Thanks very much, Bernadette, and great to be with you all today. Thanks very much for joining us. I will just get underway here, and hopefully you can all see my shared screen. So here we go. Dignitas Infinita, the doctrine, dicastery for the Doctrine of the Faith's new manifesto on bioethical and social issues, is certainly one of the more consequential documents to come out of the Vatican in recent years. But some are skeptical, and I'm just going to put a few questions up here, which we might think about. Is dignity really a central moral concept in Catholic moral theology? Does dignity language lend itself too easily to misuse and abuse? What practical guidance does a concept like dignity give us for people working in Catholic ministries? These are just a few of several questions that have been raised about the dignity discourse in ethics in recent years. I'm going to argue in the spirit of Dignitas Infinita that dignity is in fact a very important and nigh essential concept for contemporary Catholic ethics, and that it does in fact have practical consequences for how we carry out Catholic ministry. It has practical consequences for how we live. And I'll begin by offering an overview of the document and some criticisms that might be made of it, including the claim that Bernadette mentioned that its dignity is somehow like an incoherent notion. It's a bit fuzzy or squishy, and we can kind of jettison it without any cost. But I'll then explore how a series of virtues of proper responsiveness to dignity can help us to think about how dignity applies in our everyday lives. So I'm going to have a bit of a theoretical and more kind of applied section to the talk. Just by way of scaffolding, I think it's useful to go back and think about the history of the concept of dignity. This is going to be a whistle-stop tour, so it's highly inadequate, but anyway, I'll do my best to give you a little bit of background. So, I mean, dignity is an idea with a rich and complex intellectual history, and in ancient Rome, dignitas was a word used to describe the social standing that came with high political office. Dignitas was associated with the cult of the emperor, whereby the emperor would be offered gifts and praise as a sign of fealty, and also an acknowledgement of the dignity of his position. So in this sense, dignity was a public attribute, and it was grounded in one's social rank and political office. What emerges in the Christian era, however, is something quite different, namely a relational account of dignity, which is not attached to social or political role, but rather anchored in a person's relationship with God. Interestingly, part of this developing theology came from reflection on the Trinity. Early church debates surrounding personhood, the personal character of the Trinity, led to a recognition that indeed, yes, the Trinity is personal and defined by very specific personal relations on which dignity supervenes. So there's a dignity that attends to the personal relations of fatherhood, of sonship, inspiration, and so forth. What's all the relevance of this to human dignity? Well, in time, this personal concept of dignity that came out of this Trinitarian theology came to inform our understanding of the worth of human beings. And human beings were recognized as being creatures willed and loved by God. It's recognized that humanity has been redeemed by Christ, and through baptism, human beings come to share in the life of Christ. And that the calling that human beings receive from God is a personal one and comes from the author of our being. And I've got a quote there from Isaiah, which I think captures this concept that we have been called personally into communion with God. So this intimate calling is fundamental to human dignity, and it's one dimension of the Imago Dei, this idea of like being made in the image and likeness of God. And part of what that means is to be redeemed by God through Christ, and also invited into communion with God. Now, I should add, though, like that the actual term dignity is not very common in church writings prior to the Second Vatican Council. This is kind of a point that some scholars critical of the use of dignity in the church's magisterium have highlighted. But I think this should not be confused with an absence of the idea of dignity within the church prior to the Second Vatican Council. Like, it's a little bit of a confusion of like a kind of different words or different names for the same thing. And I think that that it shouldn't be thought that we just suddenly discovered within the church that we should treat people with dignity in 1965. However, it is true to say that that definitely dignity language became much more common in the church's teaching and so forth, like after the Second Vatican Council, in and after. So let's just do a little bit of a closer look here at the anatomy of dignity. What is it? What are its elements? What are its characteristics? And I think one of the challenges with a term like dignity is that it's a multifaceted concept. On the one hand, dignity appears to be intrinsic, absolute, and inalienable. But on the other hand, there's a sense in which dignity can be lost or diminished depending on one's actions or one's social or political circumstances. So what's going on here? Several scholars have variously attempted in recent years to try to sort out this conceptual puzzle and provide a coherent and systematic approach or account of these different aspects of dignity. I've got a couple of screenshots here, one from Daniel Sulmacy, who's a very highly regarded bioethicist in the United States, director of the Kennedy Institute for Ethics at Georgetown. So he's written a paper on this. Michael Rosen at Harvard has written a short book, Dignity, Its History and Meaning, which is quite helpful. And then our colleague at the Queensland Bioethics Centre here at ACU, David Kirkhofer, has also written a very good book, Human Dignity and Contemporary Ethics, on this topic. So indeed, this task is the focus of the first few sections of Dignitas Infinita, the document that is the subject of this webinar. And the document grounds the dignity, I should say, in personhood, but also the love that God shows for humanity through Jesus Christ and the divine calling that we have received through Christ to communion with God. So just to give a little bit of a gloss here on this idea of like personhood as a foundation for dignity, which the document leans into heavily. Basically, the claim here is that this classical definition of a person that I've included in the slide, given by Aquinas and going back through Aquinas to Boethius, that a person is a subsistent individual of a rational nature, that this actually clarifies the foundation of dignity. How does it do this? Like, what difference does personhood make to the kind of worth we attach to human beings? Well, I must admit, like, the section in the document discussing this is a little bit jumbled. So anyway, but I'm going to try and reconstruct what I think the thought is. And I take it that the thought is that human persons, by virtue of subsistence and rationality, they have their own internal principle of action that's been gifted to them by God and possess an intrinsic dignity because of this. The worth of persons is greater than the worth of non-human animals, for example, because we can exercise free and rational control over the course of our life and cultivate the capacities constitutive of our nature in an intentional way. And so you might distinguish, say, a human person from a non-human animal or a plant, something like that, which doesn't necessarily have the same internal principle of control and direction that you find in human life. But Dignitas Infinita does not stop here, and it also reiterates the notion that human dignity is grounded in one's relationship with God, as I've mentioned. And it's interesting actually to go and do a little bit of digging on where this idea of infinite dignity has come from, because they're actually quoting an address by John Paul II to a group of people with disabilities that John Paul gave like in the very early stages of his pontificate in 1980. And I've got a little grab there from that address. And John Paul says, God showed us shows us, I should say, just how much he loves each and every person in an unsurpassable way through Jesus Christ, and how immense a dignity is conferred on each person through him. So this, in a sense, is like the idea that they're getting at with infinite dignity, that there's a kind of surpassing or immense dignity that comes through this relationship that we have to God. But then there's a kind of helpful fourfold distinction made in terms of ways we can talk about dignity. The document considers how dignity can be diminished and lost in the contemporary world in particular ways. And then it kind of talks about how we might seek to protect and safeguard dignity. But with this consideration in view, the document articulates 4 ways in which we might think about dignity. The first is ontological, which is kind of what we talked about, like this sort of absolute dignity that transcends circumstance, is grounded in personhood and relationality. But then there's also these 3 other aspects: moral, social, and existential aspects of dignity. And these are a little bit different because these other aspects of dignity track the sense in which one can have dignity to a greater or lesser degree, depending on our moral choices, say, our social circumstances, our psycho-spiritual response to adversity, the way we respond to suffering, essentially, or the way kind of suffering affects us. We have these are also aspects of dignity, and definitely aspects that we should be attentive to as a kind of Christian community, because those are the ones that can be very much diminished, I think, when people aren't supported in the right way, and when they people are subject to neglect in various forms. So that's a little bit of an account of the documents and its kind of approach to thinking about dignity. But I don't think we've quite done the job of responding to a lot of these big criticisms out there yet. Get asked, like, does this answer the criticisms of dignity language that have come from both Catholic and secular scholars in recent years? I don't think I have, at least in this presentation, summarizing the document. So let's say a bit more. So as Bernadette mentioned, bioethicist Ruth Macklin has argued that we should jettison the notion of dignity altogether, as she thinks it's conceptually incoherent or redundant. So she thinks we should just talk about, like, in bioethics, respect for persons, the importance of respect for autonomy, and that's kind of sufficient to do all the work that dignity would otherwise be expected to do. Steven Pinker, who's a psychologist from Harvard, calls dignity a stupid idea. It was an article in the New Republic published in 2008 where he said this. And he kind of argues that that what ultimately matters in the end is this idea of, like, respect for persons, respect for human rights, respect for people's rights and liberties or welfare, and that in the end, like, dignity is this kind of like fuzzy, squishy, sentimental concepts. It's more like a psychological reaction rather than tracking something that's, like, really morally deep in human experience, and so we can kind of get rid of the concept. So I'm just going to go back here. In response to Macklin and Pinker, I will argue that autonomy is actually a much more limited concept than dignity, and that dignity includes but transcends this mere respect for persons that Pinker and Macklin are talking about. I think dignity is like, yeah, a much more morally rich idea that has far more far broader implications for how we should treat fellow human beings. And I'll talk about that at the end of the presentation. But I wanted to note, like, this is not just an attack on dignity coming from a particular kind of aggressively atheistic, say, or kind of secular group of thinkers. That in fact, there are kind of fairly eminent scholars working in the Catholic intellectual tradition who have raised big questions about dignity. And I'm going to give you an example, which is actually, like, from a lecture that I attended in the United States at Notre Dame in 2021. So I went to a conference with Alistair MacIntyre, who's this eminent Scottish philosopher, moral philosopher from the 20th century. he wrote a famous book called After Virtue, which has had a pretty significant influence on virtue ethics in moral philosophy in the 20th century. And he's an interesting guy. He's a bit of a contrarian. So every now and then he gets up at a conference and he sort of like says the opposite to what everyone else is saying, and kind of like torpedoes sort of the kind of popular view. And he sort of did this at this conference, which was on dignity, where he got up and he said that dignity is a puzzling and possibly dangerous idea. That was the name of his speech. And in a nutshell, MacIntyre has a view of dignity according to which it's basically about realizing your kind of human potential, your kind of human capacities to the full. He's got a theological concept of dignity. So in the supernatural sense, it's about knowing and loving God. But I mean, more sort of in secular or temporal terms, you can talk about participation in the common good, relationships, community participation, and flourishing in community and so forth. But MacIntyre's big question is like, if dignity is about realizing our potential, what happens when we don't realize that potential? How can you say we even have ontological dignity if that's the case? And to reiterate, we've got these distinctions that are introduced in the document, Dignitas Infinita, where it talks about like the moral, social, and existential dimensions of dignity. So you could say, okay, well, the document kind of deals with this. But that's not the case, because what MacIntyre is talking about here is ontological or intrinsic dignity, something even deeper. So it seems like he's saying in response to the document, infinite dignity doesn't exist, or at least it doesn't exist in every human life. So where then does this lead us? Where then does this leave us, I should say? Well, insofar as we locate dignity, as MacIntyre does, in this kind of like space of human fulfillment, I think there is a problem here. I think MacIntyre is kind of right to say like that we're all kind of realizing our potential as human beings to varying degrees. Theologically speaking, we're all on like different points of a spectrum of knowledge and love of God. Temporally or secularly speaking, we're all on a spectrum of participation in the common good, of sort of having robust social connection and close social relationships and so forth. And there is a sense in which the dignity that we possess is not infinite in that sense. But I think perhaps what might be useful here is to introduce some metaphysical conceptual machinery to help us out. So bear with me here. This is a little bit abstract, but in metaphysics, you have this concept of potentiality, I should say, and actuality. So we have potential for some things as by virtue of a kind of human nature, potential for knowledge, potential for health, potential for social relationships and so forth. And we can realize these potentials to differing degrees. We can actualize them depending on how we choose to use our lives and the support that we have in life. So I think there's a sense in which you can actually say that, like, at a minimum, we have a kind of radical and indeed infinite potential for dignity by virtue of the fact that we're loved by God and called into communion, and even by virtue of the fact that we have the capacity, at least, to participate in the common good. We have a radical capacity for fulfillment through community and through these kind of more supernatural goods. And so I think the parable of the prodigal son actually is relevant here, because if you think about what happens in the prodigal son, is the prodigal son goes away from the father. He takes his kind of inheritance and he squanders it on loose living, and the prodigal son ends up down in the dumps and estranged from his father and neglected by a cold and unwelcoming society. But then the prodigal son goes back, right? He goes back to the father, and the father says to him when he welcomes him, he says, "Everything that is mine is yours. Everything that is mine is yours." And there's a sense in which there's a sharing of the plenitude of the riches of God in this case, with humanity, that is infinite. And we can, I think, in that sense, talk about how you have this kind of potential for infinite dignity, which we can realize to varying degrees depending on how much we identify with the prodigal son. But I think there's something there, which provides a pretty compelling response to MacIntyre's scathing critique. But I mean, you may be wondering, why are we talking about all this kind of like highfalutin theology and metaphysics and so forth? Like, what is the relevance to, say, Catholic ministries in general and healthcare practice in particular? I mean, the Plunkett Centre for Ethics specializes in bioethics, so I probably better say something like this to make sure I do my job here. So just in terms of dignity in practice and what Dignitas Infinita actually kind of says practically about bioethical issues, there's a whole list of topics that the document addresses. It reiterates the Church's opposition to abortion, euthanasia, and surrogacy. This material is complemented with social doctrine on poverty, migration, human trafficking, sexual abuse, and violence against women. The document reiterates Pope Francis's opposition to the death penalty in notably stronger terms than John Paul II, and appears to raise questions about the contemporary applicability of just war theory. So those comments have all caused some consternation within the kind of the Catholic community, if you will, in terms of the reception of the document, and broadly. The document also criticizes gender theory and opposes the practice of gender transition medical treatment. And then Dignitas Infinita also contains a discussion of the theology of disability, and will hopefully lend itself to further exploration of this area. Because in the end, I mean, that's, I think, like the name of the document, Dignitas Infinita, it's taken from this this passage from an address by John Paul II to a group of people with disabilities. And I think there's a great interest here and potential as well to develop this aspect of theological reflection. Give me 1 second here. So it's interesting to note that you've got this like clarion call to protect dignity in this document, and that other scholars have raised concerns about the erosion of human dignity in the context of healthcare in particular. And I'm going to fly through this because I need to hand over to Jim to make sure I don't take too much time here. But these are just some books that have been released in recent years, focusing on the idea that like dignity is somehow at risk in healthcare in particular, just in terms of the way we kind of treat patients today, or like reductionism in medicine, or a loss of the sense of the sacred, or whatever, like a loss of the sense of the embodied nature of the human person. There's a lot going on in these books, but essentially the kind of common thread is something like what Dignitas Infinita is saying, is that there's an issue here. We need to kind of be sort of aware of risks or threats to human dignity that are out there. So just to close, I'm going to pick up on this like nice paper by David Albert Jones, on who's a friend of the Plunkett Centre for Ethics. He's director of the Anscombe Bioethics Centre in Oxford, and hopefully we'll be able to talk at one of these webinars in the future. But he's written a nice paper on a virtue ethics approach to human dignity in healthcare. And I think this speaks to the idea of like, what's the practical upshot of Dignitas Infinita and the Church's emphasis on dignity in healthcare? Like, what positive norms does dignity provide? It provides a whole series of negative norms, like you can't do this, you can't do that, you can't do this other thing. But like, what positively does dignity tell us in terms of how we should act? And I think in the end, to provide a bridge concept, we might think of the idea of piety, actually, which is central to the Hippocratic Oath. It's a central kind of theme. I shall piously watch over myself and my art, says Hippocrates. And piety is often associated with kind of like filial piety, like having appropriate respect and regard for one's parents and elders. But there's also a broader sense in which is kind of like our duties to all members of family, or relatives, even superiors, and so forth. So, I mean, we're using this concept of the human family in documents like in Dignitas Infinita. So what does it mean to show piety to all members of the human family. Well, on the one hand, there's kind of this observance that we talked about at the start of this talk, where you kind of like honoring the emperor, you show respect, honesty, respect privacy. You acknowledge the dignity of the person through your kind of actions or statements. But then there's a more hands-on version, which we might talk about as misericordia, which is kind of classic scholastic virtue coming out of Scripture, which I think also requires that we kind of go and enter into a company and help someone through suffering. So compassion, hospitality, accompaniment, and material support might be relevant there. So I'm going to finish there. I mean, I just wanted to highlight how I think dignity is not just like an abstract ideal, or it's not just a kind of series of negative, it's not just generating a series of negative prohibitions, but it actually really kind of informs, I think, an ethic of care that's fundamental to Catholic ministries in general and Catholic healthcare in particular. Thanks very much.
Xavier, thank you very much indeed for an absolutely wonderful talk to us, which I predict people will want copies of to read very carefully. Xavier, thanks a million. We'll go now directly to Jim Franklin. Jim, I think you have your slides up there. Am I right?
Yes, thank you. Yes, one moment.
Welcome, Jim, and over to you.
Okay. One moment. Thank you, Bernadette, for the invitation. I'll talk mostly about the foundational ideas at the beginning of Dignitas Infinita, then say something briefly about a couple of the controversial conclusions, such as on capital punishment and gender. The document begins with the sections on the foundations of ethics. They're very unlike other views on the topic, such as Thomas' natural law theory, or virtue ethics or utilitarianism. It starts like this: every person possesses an infinite dignity, inalienably grounded in his or her very being, which prevails in and beyond every circumstance, state, or situation the person may ever encounter. Here's the rest. I'll just stop talking for a moment while you take a moment to read that and absorb it. I emphasize a few things. First, as indicated here, the inherence of dignity in human nature, the accessibility to reason alone, and the connection, nevertheless, to humans being in the image and likeness of God. Well, there are three things you could think about dignity as so used: either that it's a good idea and important, or that it's a bad idea, or that it's a platitude without much content. Well, I believe it's good and important, and it agrees quite closely with the theory I gave in my book, The Worth of Persons, The Foundation of Ethics. I'll get to that. But maybe the most natural thing to think first is that dignity is a platitude. There are lots of concepts that we're all in favour of, but they don't mean much. They're high-sounding but too content-free, like progress, common sense, world's best practice, Australian values, school spirit. So what does school spirit commit you to, except that there is to be more cheering at the football? These notions, you might suspect, are used when someone is trying to put a fast one over. As one professor of moral theology puts it at Oxford, the notion of human dignity functions in moral and political writing as a rhetorical substitute for argument. That is a fair challenge. If the notion of dignity is to be used, it has to be explained. One reason for thinking that the idea of dignity is not a platitude is that there are some very smart philosophers attacking it. As Xavier said, he was present at a talk when Alistair MacIntyre gave entitled Human Dignity, a Puzzling and Possibly Dangerous Idea. He's been followed by Ed Feser, a leading Thomas natural law theorist. Those are very intelligent and well-informed guys, and it's worth looking briefly at what they say as it clarifies what has to be explained about dignity. McIntyre says that talk of human dignity only got going from the time of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights in 1948, and then it spread everywhere without gaining any useful content. This quote from Feser gives a flavour of what they don't like. Shouting human dignity does exactly zero work. Take a moment to read that. So his idea that real content comes from notions like justice or virtues like that, or intrinsically evil, natural law reasoning, and that dignity doesn't do any work. Well, McIntyre and Feser are right about several things. Firstly, dignity is a novelty. Though there's some background in Kant and some scattered remarks, such as the one Xavier gave about person in Aquinas, the use of dignity in this foundational ethical sense is a post-war fad in human rights circles and then in Catholic circles. For example, the Vatican II document Dignitatis Humanae and the Catechism. Benedict XVI says that the Church's ethics, quote, is based on man's creation in the image of God, a datum which gives rise to the inviolable dignity of the human person and the transcendent value of natural moral norms. Well, that is false. Traditionally, the Church's Catholic ethics is not based on dignity, but on Thomas natural law theory, which is different, and as Feser says, doesn't include a foundational notion of dignity, though it might be compatible with it. They're also right that the concept of dignity and its relation to claims about what is right and wrong hasn't been well explained philosophically. So let me tell you about my effort to do that in The Worth of Persons, the Foundation of Ethics. But first, just to say something briefly about language, I take it that dignity and worth are the same thing. I prefer the word worth to the word dignity for two reasons. Firstly, an Anglo-Saxon word is always better than a Latin one. Anglo-Saxon words are short, clean, and blunt, whereas Latinate vocabulary is multisyllabic, cerebral, equivocal, and predominantly obfuscatory when not totally unintelligible. See what I mean? Secondly, if you use dignity, you need to distinguish the inherent or ontological meaning of dignity from other meanings, such as in, well, he considered hard work below his dignity, or lying in a hospital bed with nurses wiping your bum is undignified. As Xavier explained, the Dignitas Infinita document distinguishes three other meanings of dignity, which is fine, but something of a distraction from the main game. So I ask you to switch to worth of persons for the moment. But that's just a matter of language. Worth and dignity are the same. So here are the main ideas of the book in brief. Firstly, ethics is not fundamentally about what to do, about right actions, duties, virtues, human rights, and so on, or those things, though those things are ethically important. There's something more basic. Take this question. Why is the death of a human being a tragedy, but the explosion of a lifeless galaxy just a firework? Tragedy is a moral notion, pointing to the moral importance of the kind of thing that can be the subject of tragedy. It's not about what to do. The phrase "the worth of persons" names what it is that gives humans their moral importance, whatever it is that makes what happens to them morally significant. And if you look at moral issues of right and wrong, virtues, etc., they all lead back to the worth of person. For example, the basic reason why murder is wrong is not a command of God or the greatest happiness of the greatest number or anything like that. It's the badness of being dead, which matters because the person killed matters. That's where you have to start. Next, it's possible to say what properties of humans give them their worth. In philosophical jargon, the properties on which their worth supervenes. Their height and colour are not morally relevant, but their rationality and emotional structure are. The traditional answer to what makes persons valuable is rationality. Augustine says, man's excellence consists in the fact that God made him in his own image by giving him an intellectual soul, which raises him above the beasts of the field. Well, that's a start, in that an intellectual kind of rationality is an important feature distinguishing humans from the rest of creation. But as a total story, it's a little narrow. I suggest adding, as bases for the worth of persons, these things: consciousness, emotional structure, capacity to act freely for reasons, the unity and diversity of the mind, individuality, and a few others, with the whole integrated package making humans unique and supremely important. Obviously, that needs a lot of thinking about. I've just given a few headlines here. If you're wondering what happens with humans that appear to lack some of those features, like one suffering dementia, then their tragedy consists in the fact that they do, in fact, as humans, have those properties, but they can't exercise them. Humans have equal worth. A lot of justification needed for that. Next, the worth of humans, the worth of persons, is inherent in human nature and is not conferred. It's not conferred by society, God, or anything else. And here, the wording of Dignitas Infinita is sometimes dubious because it sometimes suggests that God does confer dignity by loving humans. If in fact humans, as we know them to be, were the result of a random evolutionary process across eons of time without divine input, then we would still have the same inherent worth because it's inherent and supervenes on the properties we actually have, not on the history of our origins. If we are, on the other hand, made in the image and likeness of God, the result is the same. Worth belongs to us because of who we are. There are questions about the possible worth of cats, rainforests, etc., but we can't go into it at the moment. The question then is what the relation is between the worth of persons, an inherent quality, and right actions. Does the worth of persons imply particular moral positions, such as the wrongness of the death penalty? Dignitas Infinita says that the death penalty, quote, violates the inalienable dignity of every person, regardless of the circumstances, giving the impression that the wrongness of the death penalty follows directly from the worth of persons without need of any further premises. Is that right? This is a tricky question and needs a lot of care to answer. In principle, the worth of persons does have consequences, strictly logical consequences, for what ought to be done. But typically, some further premises are needed, and typically, those premises involve a deeper understanding of the bases of human worth in human nature, such as rationality, emotional structure, and so on, as listed above. Let's take just a few varied examples. Well, the wrongness of murder is easy, as I was saying. It does follow directly from the worth of persons. Because humans are worth something, their being deprived of existence is an evil, and hence it's wrong to bring it about. The classic case of self-defense exhibits well what can be expected from a foundation in the worth of persons and what can't. In that case, there's a conflict between the right of the person under attack to live and the right of the attacker to live. Both of those are based on the worth of the two persons. Without that, you don't understand why each should have a right to life. The worth of persons doesn't resolve the dilemma, or what should have happened in Bondi Junction a couple of weeks ago in extreme circumstances. What it does is explain why there's a dilemma in the first place, namely that both persons in conflict have worth, and hence it's bad if either dies. The right of persons to education, Universal Declaration, Article 26, follows from the worth of persons, but with the additional premise that rationality is one of the bases of worth. Knowledge is the perfection of rationality, and education is what enables that to happen. So, rational beings have a right to it. Cases like sex change, as discussed in Section 60 of Dignitas Infinita, are more difficult, but the worth of persons' perspective does have something to say about how you should approach them. The document says this: the dignity of the body cannot be considered inferior to that of the person as such. They mean the body in its sexed form, and then says, it follows that any sex change intervention, as a rule, risks threatening the unique dignity the person has received from the moment of conception. A worth of person's perspective will say that you need to investigate how being embodied does contribute to human dignity, and that psychiatric as well as philosophical evidence will be relevant. Psychiatry has clarified how body image and identity is a different and more mental entity than the physical body, which raises the possibility of mismatch between the two. I certainly believe that the epidemic of confused teens being given puberty blockers and having their breasts cut off is the major new medical scandal of our time. But the case is different with mature adults who have grown up always aware of a mismatch between their sex organs and their internal sexual identity. What they ought to do is not easy to say, but a worth of person's perspective suggests the need for a lot of listening and psychiatric research before getting to the moral instructions. The fact that the bases of worth are so heavily mental, rationality, emotional structure and so on, suggests that in understanding human identity, we give a lot of weight to body image, body schema, and social image relative to physical bodily qualities. Once you've said that colour and size are irrelevant to human worth, you might be wary of the relevance of other physical properties. I saw this on Facebook this week. Yeah, well, sure, you can explain to me why that's different, but still, let's be careful from moving from physical properties to morally relevant mental ones. In summary, dignity or worth is a contentful idea. It's essential to understanding what ethics is all about. Thank you.
Jim, thank you very much indeed. What a wonderful compliment to Xavier's first talk. We're greatly in your debt as we are in Xavier's debt. Now, what I'm going to propose to do, we did agree on our format, but I'm going to ask Xavier and Jim whether they would be happy to give up the opportunity of talking directly to each other, just because we've only got about 25 minutes at most.
Yes, sure.
Would you be happy with that, Jim? And would you be happy with that, Xavier?
Yes, that's fine. I mean, I think can I just thank Jim for a fantastic presentation and a very rigorous I think exploration of the ideas here. And I kind of papered over a lot of the sort of really kind of like hot button issues, and Jim has gone like I think full throttle to sort of explore some of the sort of interesting questions. And I think I think that's really like that'll probably come up in Q&A as well. I would just say like I think maybe one area where Jim and I differ, which is an interesting, like we might explore this in the Q&A, is I probably have a more embodied conception of the human person, focusing on the idea that we do not have our bodies, but rather are our bodies. And I think that's probably where we're sort of splitting on some of these more practical issues. So anyway, maybe we can kind of discuss that in the Q&A now, but it's up to the audience.
Xavier, thank you for that. Jim, would you like to say something in response?
Well, I just think there's something missing from the debate about these things, in that we don't grasp properly how much body image we carry around with ourselves, and that's very important to identity. I don't like to draw the conclusions. I just believe there's let's talk about in different areas, things about phenomenology and body image, body schema, how we see ourselves in the social world, but the discussion hasn't properly come together. And I just urge that it do that on a wide scope, so that we can really start thinking properly about internal bodily and internal versus bodily identity. That's all I'll say.
Jim, thanks very much. Okay, well, what I'm now going to do is to hand over to my colleague, Steve Matthews. Steve, over to you to run the discussion in whatever way you think.
Thanks very much, Bernadette, and thanks to our speakers. So I have a large pool of the participants, and I'd invite you to raise your hand. There's some functionality at the bottom of your screen if you wish to ask a question. I can't guarantee. I've got Simon Kajalski, I think is your name. If you could unmute yourself, Simon, and ask your first question, and I'll keep an eye on other raised hands. Go ahead.
Sure, perfect. This is a question for Xavier Symons. So thanks a lot for the very engaging presentation. I'd like to ask something that essentially that pertains to your colloquy with Alistair McIntyre's claims about dignity. And it's essentially a question about how to reconcile the idea of the impossibility of losing the Imago Dei with traditional views of hell as eternal. So essentially, if the infinite dignity is more or less something synonymous with ontological dignity, and it cannot be lost, and it has relational dimensions, and this this potential to grow in further holiness. How do you sort of reconcile that with the traditional view of hell that is held to be kind of a state of eternal separation from God, and a lack of, or an impossibility to further grow in holiness or have that potentiality?
Thanks, Simon. So very briefly, I would say that the distinction I would draw is between this life and the next, and the condition of this life versus our condition in the next. So I think there is a sense in which there is always a radical, like the future is always hopeful in this life, or the future is open to possibility in this life, such that I think this idea of like a radical potential for dignity in the sense of human fulfillment is still part of that horizon of the future in this life. Whereas I think theologically, I mean, look, I'm not an expert, I'm totally above my pay grade here, but like I think theologically speaking, in the next life, it's sort of like set. You're sort of stuck with the state of things. So as such, that radical possibility doesn't obtain in that context. So that's my sort of attempt at a brief answer. I don't know if I've done justice to your question, but hopefully it's vaguely helpful.
Thank you.
Jim, did you want to follow up at all on that one?
Just to say that, well, we hope that God's mercy is so strong that hell turns out to be empty. Let's hope.
Okay, we have a second question from R. Tilly. Thank you. Thank you.
Okay, thanks for that. Look, I just want to make some comments. A lot of the questions seem to, I think, possibly steer clear of what the document is trying to do. I mean, it was often said, and I guess this is in respect of the statements like by McIntyre, and perhaps this is what Franklin meant when he said, what is a relation of the inherent to actions? I actually tend to think the document itself, which says, follows on from Fratelli Tutti and such, is answering that. I think it's very important that the point is that when we look at natural law theory, of course it develops, and surely this is part of the magisterium, such that when it uses a quote from St. Thomas about, a subsistent individual of a rational nature, the question is, what do we mean by subsistent? And surely the document, like other documents for a long time by the popes, have defined it more and more by reference of deferral to God, that is the image of God. I just think that terms like autonomy and freedom, which are used, are explicitly being redefined from a more modernist, let us say, anti-essential meontological view. I think by meontological I actually mean anti-essential. I just think some of the problem too is the language of using terms like ethics, because that, I think, brings into the argument far too much of a Kantian view, which I would argue redefines morality by reference more to a sociality that is divorced from ontology. And I guess just to paraphrase someone like Steve Bannon, politics may be downstream from culture, but culture is downstream from metaphysics. And I actually tend to think that's what Francis and others are doing. And I guess that's not, perhaps in a way, what I'm hearing. And that's possibly because I'm not paying attention or don't get it. But anyway.
Well, I agree that sociality and ethics is downstream from metaphysics, and that they're trying to do that, trying to strengthen the metaphysical start, and I'm all for that. I think it's confusing to try and do that both by saying that dignity is inherent in how humans are and that it's conferred by God. I just hope there's some more thought about that.
Very briefly, I think, I mean, the quote you mentioned, like, I think it's Richard John Niehaus, actually, the founding editor of First Things, actually, like, had a similar quote, like that politics is downstream from culture and culture is downstream from religion. And I think that there's something to the idea, like, that kind of, I don't know, revelation, like, sort of is fundamental and like helping us to understand ourselves. And sure, like, that needs to be borne in mind, I think, when you're reading documents like this, that it's not, this is not just kind of Kant with a bit of like Catholic window dressing. That this is like a seriously biblically based document, very much leaning into a tradition that predates modernity. So yeah, I'd agree with that. I think you're muted, Steve.
Steve Matthews, where are you? Let me
Sorry, I was on. Yeah, sorry, I was muted. It's hard to keep track, isn't it? Sorry, Natasha, Michael, we have you. If you could ask your question, just need to unmute. Thank you.
Terrific. Thanks, Xavier and James. I really enjoyed that. I'm trying to get my young doctors engaged here. So, Xavier, you're very good at helping me translate some of this higher level thinking into the reality of those of us who are working in the clinical space. So I have really two questions for you. I mean, the concepts of the 4 dimensions of dignity are new to me and interesting. And working with David Jones recently, looking at 10 years worth of data coming from Oregon and Washington as to the reasons for which people seek assisted dying, what is clear to note is the trend of the loss of dignity is falling, and the fear of burden and the fear of financial concerns are rising. And we were trying to unpick as to the reasons why. And I do wonder whether a loss of an ontological sense is partly a contributing factor, that people don't see, understand an inherent dignity, and whether there's an existential component that drives this, people's existential fears that we know are unreported and unreported are drivers of a sense of loss of dignity. That's my first question to you. Why are we seeing this trend? The second question is, you talked about the concept of dignity as being relational, and you talked about relational to God. My question is, what about relational to others, which is what we see in healthcare? How do we explore reciprocity? How do we explore benevolence? How do we explore that relationship that enables us to help people understand that dignity can be found amongst those of your family, your carers, etc.?
That's great. Thanks very much, Natasha. Those are two really good, like, practical questions. And I think with the euthanasia question, I mean, in a way, like I mentioned at the end, these two sort of like virtues of proper responsiveness to dignity, or kind of respect for dignity. So you've got like kind of the negative, as in like kind of negative in the sense of sort of what we can't do, or sort of like what we sort of the norms that we need to observe, the sort of the laws that we need to keep in mind, so to speak, or conventions for interacting with other human beings, to respect dignity. And that was what I called observance, or observantia. And then on the other hand, you've got the kind of the more active, interventional, so to speak, side of things, which is this idea of misericordia, like kind of mercy, entering into the suffering of others, accompanying them, assisting them, and so forth. And I think in a way, like maybe what we've got happening with this sort of the situation in Oregon, say, is we're doing the kind of like respect, the sort of hands-off approach really well, where we kind of let people make their own decisions, and we sort of are very cognizant of the importance of respect for autonomy, but we're not doing as well the kind of community building, the sort of relational side of things, the showing of compassion, the sort of establishing of networks of social solidarity and support. What McIntyre calls relationships of uncalculated giving and gracious receiving that are essential for any flourishing society. And I think there's a sense in which that is totally missing today in some contexts, and may explain why people are more concerned about being a burden now than before, because there's a loss of the sense that it's actually a good thing for people to be a burden. And as Gil Mylander wrote once in an essay in First Things, I want to be a burden on my loved ones. I think that should actually be an aspiration of us all, because it's good for everyone. Is the thought. Just briefly to your second point about the broader relationality piece in kind of building, I think, a sense of the importance of relationality to thinking about healthcare practice, the responsibilities of doctors and nurses to their patients. I think part of that is kind of just good medical practice, like good kind of psychosocial spiritual care. So sort of training doctors in the sort of not just the sort of technical aspects of medicine, but all the other parts of medicine that I think are important. And Jeff Bishop, I put up, one of the books I put up is called The Anticipatory Corpse, by Jeff Bishop, where he basically says, like, we've got to a point in medicine where we sort of see the human body and human persons in a very reductionistic way. And the first body you see in medicine, sadly in medical training, is a dead body. You kind of, the first thing you see is a cadaver, often, like, that's the first human body that you interact with. So he's got this critique where he says, like, we're just increasingly seeing the human person in medicine in a reductionistic terms. And I think we need to kind of break out of that a bit to get more into this relational paradigm. I'll leave it at that, but thanks again, Natasha.
Thank you, Natasha. So we have Matt Carney. Please unmute, Matt.
Thanks, Steve. And I just, listening to Natasha, I really wanted to comment on that question about what's the impact in healthcare practice. Because the question of, is somebody worthy of our care, is a really important question. And it's one of those ones which is often, I guess, it's in the background, but it's in the foreground. So it's in the back of our minds, but it's in the foreground of our decision making in terms of allocation of resources, to the extent that the decision-making process, how hard am I going to work for this person based on what I see in front of me? And it's a very challenging thing, particularly when healthcare workers see someone who comes back repeatedly because they, for example, are using drugs, for example, and that's causing harms. So the question of dignity and the way in which it frames and reframes our understanding of the person who presents for healthcare, I think, is a very significant question for us even today.
So I don't want to crowd out Jim here. I really want to invite Jim to comment if he has any reflections on these questions. I think that's a fantastic question, Matt. So I think, yeah, in a way you could say like the issue in healthcare at the moment is not so much kind of that people don't care, is that they care too much. And in a way they're experiencing moral distress when you've got these patients, these kind of complex cases where you've done everything you can reasonably be expected to do. And yet it sort of seems like, on the one hand, that you should do more, or you might have this sort of sense that like, this is a tragic situation where I just feel like I don't know what to do. We have limited resources. We can't really do much more for this patient. And yet they're still in a terrible state. Like what sort of is the right thing to do then? I think the topic of moral distress and moral injury is worthy of a whole lot more attention. And maybe that might be a subject for a future webinar. I think the one thing I would say though is that like it is true to say that there are still a lot of these complex cases in the Catholic health sector, but at least structurally across the sector, kind of mission from a mission perspective, there is an emphasis on caring for vulnerable population groups, and that's kind of clear and undeniable. And in a way, I didn't mention that in my presentation, partly because I thought it's like already pretty clear. Like that's one way in which the ethos of this document is already reflected in practice. And I think the risk maybe might be that because of various structural pressures, economic and so forth, or kind of corporate pressures, that ethos gets lost in the sector. But I think it's important to protect it. I'll have to think a bit more about your question. I think that's very to the point, Matt, for what we should be thinking about coming out of this discussion.
Jim, did you want to?
No, I didn't have any. No comment.
Okay. I just might introduce something along the lines that you were talking about, Xavier, in relation to some of the practices in the US, where we have insurance companies having more control over the process and the practices of healthcare. And we have, this tidal wave of private equity companies coming in and turning hospitals into businesses and with pernicious effects. And I've been reading quite a lot about this. And this issue of moral injury is coming up more and more. That is to say, healthcare workers own moral principles and own moral agency in their work cannot be utilized. And this is causing lots of harms. And many of the burnout cases that we read about are redescribed as moral injury cases. And it strikes me that we often talk about the dignity of the patient, but the dignity of healthcare workers, I think, is involved here. And it would be interesting to apply the Dignitas Infinita to those particular cases. I imagine it'd be the social dimension or one of those other dimensions, and to tease that out, because there's a big story to tell, and I suspect things are getting worse. Xavier or Jim, do you have any thoughts about that?
Well, I do have one thought is that the moral perspective of healthcare administrators is quite different from the moral perspective of frontline health workers, and
absolutely
we have to think separately about them. you kind of know where you are if you're faced with a patient. You've got so many resources and you do what you can with them. Healthcare allocation and bureaucrats in back rooms, it's quite a different thing. But and they may be, should they be, totting up quality adjusted life years, and you can think it's impersonal, but something like that has to be done. I think maybe we need to have a separate ethics of healthcare for those, maybe separate courses. I don't advise on what should be done about them, but it does need thinking about.
Yeah, I don't have too much to add, Steve. I think I completely agree with your suggestion, and there's work to be done there.
Okay, thanks. We have a question from Carol Ong.
Thanks, Steve, and thank you for the great presentations as well. I think that the concept of moral distress, moral injury, and moral disequilibrium is very significant, and I think it might be time for us to look at it from a different point of view. I agree with you, Xavier. I think this is a totally urgent aspect of healthcare. In terms of the dignity, I think we do talk about the dignity of the human person, and I agree with you. There is also the dignity of the team, the dignity of the service, and as well as the whole health sector. When we talk about moral distress, moral disequilibrium, and moral injury, it doesn't lie with the individual. It also impacts on all aspects of the health sector. And I think to look at it from one aspect is insufficient. I think we need to look at it from the aspect of the organization as well. There is such a thing as team moral distress, and there is such a theme as organizational moral distress. I think it's being borne out in the here and now, certainly in healthcare in Australia.
Yeah, I think that's really interesting. Yeah, zooming out. I think you have to, in a way, with moral distress. That's right. You have to zoom out a little bit, because in the end, usually, I mean, classically, moral distress is defined as like knowing what the right thing is to do, or sort of being conflicted at least, and then not being able to act kind of in accord with your kind of considered ideas because of these institutional constraints on your agency, like having your agency constrained by institutional factors. I mean, that's Andrew Jamerson's classic kind of definition of moral distress. So I think that you need to look at these broader team-based and institutional factors, and how different parts of an organization are interacting to produce this frustration at the kind of level of the individual clinicians working there. And I think it even intersects as well with these kind of broader questions of resource allocation at a macro level, because they can set the stage for inevitable staff distress and burnout, if you're kind of placing just unreasonable constraints on what staff can actually do, like because you're short-staffed already, or people have to work overtime, or because of the patient volume, or the resources that are available to give to patients. Yeah, so all these factors can already stack the deck for moral distress and even moral injury to occur. So I'm not an expert on this topic, so I think it'd be good to get a team together to work on this.
All right, thanks very much, Xavier, and thanks to all our question askers. We've run out of questions and we're rapidly approaching our time. So I'll pass back to Bernadette Tobin to wrap up our session. Thanks, Bernadette.
Steve, thank you very much. And what an interesting discussion. I know there are with us today some very senior administrators in the Catholic healthcare system, people who I greatly admire, who have to deal with what has just recently been called institutional moral distress on a daily basis. And I'd be very keen the next time we have an opportunity to get them to tell us about the challenges so we can think collectively and usefully about them. But what I need to do and what I want to do is to thank Xavier and Jim Franklin for two terrific presentations. As I say, I certainly want to read them again carefully myself. And I want to thank everybody who's participated in the discussion, because I think we're all keen to understand the contents of this new document, but more importantly, to turn it over in our minds. So Xavier, the director of the Plunkett Centre, will follow up today's webinar with a very short survey. He promises it'll be short, to ask you what you think about today's webinar, with a view to organising similar events in the future. And Xavier will post the webinar on the YouTube in a manner in which it can be easily found. So good afternoon to everyone, and we really look forward to seeing you the next time.
Yeah.